Hey, Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7 by 7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. And thank you especially to the patrons who help make this daily dose of Star Wars joy possible for you every single day with their support at patreon.com/SW7x7. And also, let's say thank you today to all the mothers out there, too. It is Mother's Day here in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world. And so thank you, Mom, for introducing me to Star Wars. And if you are a mother out there listening to this, then I hope you are being celebrated the way you ought to be today. All right, so I am thrilled to welcome Cass Sunstein back to the show. It's not the kind of person that you necessarily expect to be writing about Star Wars, but he has now twice. And, this is why. This is his bio. He's the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law School. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Yeah, not exactly the person you expect to be writing about Star Wars, but he does, and very well. So since his time in the Obama administration, he has served in the U.S. government in several different roles. An advisor to many nations and international organizations, he is the author of Nudge with Richard Thaler, Noise with Daniel Kahneman and Olivier Savoni, The World According to Star Wars, which is why he was on the podcast the first time, and Wiser with Reed Hasty. His new book is coming out May 21st. It's called How to Become Famous with the subtitle Lost Einsteins, Forgotten Superstars, and How the Beatles Came to Be. And yes, he talks about Star Wars and about George Lucas and about the making of A New Hope as part of his examination. Now, he does say in the prologue that one of his main points is that there is no recipe for how to become famous, and in that sense, my title is a bit of a cheat. But he does go on to say that identifiable factors matter, and they can be enlisted. And those are the kinds of things we're going to talk about in regard to Star Wars and how it became famous. So, yeah, I think that's probably enough of an intro, so let's get into it. This is the first half of my conversation with Cass Sunstein, the author of the upcoming How to Become Famous. Cass Sunstein, welcome to Star Wars 7 by 7. How are you today?
I'm great and thrilled to be here.
Thank you. I'm thrilled you're here. I'm thrilled you're back. Actually, you were here a couple of years ago when you wrote The World According to Star Wars, so thank you again for saying yes. And Star Wars, apparently, you can't you can't quit it, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, because now it is a part of your latest book, How to Be Famous. So I think I want to start by asking you, what is it about Star Wars that particularly speaks to you or that you find compelling?
Well, everything about Star Wars I find compelling. The fact that it moves like a son of a bitch, as one of the producers of the Star Wars canon said. The fact that it has romance and energy and goodness and evil and freedom of choice, fantastic. And to me, the fact that a child will do anything to save a parent, even if the parent is the worst person in the universe, or maybe number two worst person in the universe.
Yeah.
I think that's extremely moving, and that Lucas is able to deliver that, and the successors play with that kind of thing is justifies its canonical status.
And so when you approach the idea of your new book, How to Be Famous, I gather is it just because you are that deeply connected to Star Wars that you thought to yourself, yes, this has to absolutely be a part of the book and what I investigate?
Yeah, you can think of the book How to Become Famous as a child of The World According to Star Wars. That book got me, of course, very focused on Star Wars Genesis. How did it get to be so central to our culture? What made it resonate in the way it did? And then I've obsessed for the last few years about various success stories, both in business and in culture. Of course, Star Wars is central to that obsession, but there's so many things. There's Taylor Swift, there's the Beatles, there's Barack Obama, there's Donald Trump, there's Steve Jobs, there's Elon Musk. How did all of these people become so central? And the Star Wars tale actually overlaps with the tales for all of them, not that any of them is a Jedi master.
So is it fair to say that Star Wars actually almost provided a jumping off point for this book then?
Yeah. So the fact that Star Wars, first to understand what made it connect with young people, old people, so many generations, that's extremely fascinating. And Lucas's own interest in what surprised him, that is the exuberance of the movies, because as a person, George Lucas is amazing and kind and himself. You wouldn't say he's overflowing with exuberance in his persona, but his movies are, and at their best, the successors have a feature of that, their own, of course, because their own directors and writers and authors. But the fact is that the Star Wars exuberance and a serendipitous rise to the top is enduringly fascinating. I think it tells us something about, forgive the word, Star Trek too. It something about cultural figures. It tells us something about Emily Dickinson and Johann Sebastian Bach, neither of whom was exactly a world beater in their time. It tells us something about Bob Dylan. It tells us a lot about things that we now see as defining of our culture. Star Wars is toward the top of the list, but things that almost didn't make it or that at the inception were regarded as the people who were, so to speak, bankrolling them as doomed or not with a whole lot of promise.
hmm And so you mentioned serendipity as part of that, and one of the things that you talk about in the book is the possibility of serendipity being engineered at some level, but it's not the only factor that plays into how somebody becomes famous. And I guess a little bit of a spoiler alert that it's not necessarily a perfect formula that you can predict with anything, but what are some of the elements of how to become famous that you've sussed out from the admittedly small sample size? And I'm saying admittedly because you actually cop to that in the book. You're like, well, it is a small sample size, so you're dealing with the limitations of such a thing.
Okay, so the book is a guaranteed formula for success. Success and fame or your money back. It basically is a step by step, a fail safe, a certain path. It just outlines the path and you're there. Uh,
Mhm.
Actually, as you note, it's closer to the opposite that people get struck by lightning. Star Wars got struck by lightning. So did John Keats got struck by lightning. There are many, we won't name them, people in our culture who had the same. Juliette Binoche, we'll name her. She's probably my favorite actor. She got struck by lightning, and the fact that they got all of these people where they did had a lot to do with lightning. Of course, lightning is a metaphor. You can think of it instead as a lottery. The fact that Star Wars is amazing put it in a very good position to succeed in the way that it did. And while the network had no faith in it, and George Lucas didn't expect anything like what happened, audiences were bowled over. I can remember I was, less than a month old at the time. Okay, I was a little older than that. I remember it very well, and the first scenes of A New Hope were, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And so the quality and originality were breathtaking, and that was certainly central. The fact that Star Wars, like William Blake, the poet, when he got famous, which was long after his death, connected with the zeitgeist, the idea of rebellion, and also successful and joyful rebellion rather than failed and humorless rebellion. That was very connected with the time. It's connected with our time too, by the way. One reason why Star Wars is resonating now. The fact that it had champions consisting both of people early on who said, movie theaters show this one, it's going to be good, or we'll give you a little economic incentive to show this one. That pattern we see over and over again with fame. That's what happened for the Beatles. There was a relentless champion who incentivized people to give them a chance. Something similar to that, happened for Jane Austen, who was
Mm.
not in her lifetime that big a deal. She wasn't a failure, but she wasn't that big a deal. And then afterwards, she got champions. That's completely central. Widespread distribution, of course, is crucial, and that can to some extent be engineered, though it's not always easy because the distributors might say, a movie about there's a character named Chewbacca, how like that.
And so you mentioned the zeitgeist in throughout the book, but also in particular to the chapter with Star Wars. And you actually came to a conclusion that, maybe not. And you gave some interesting examples about how, could you, if it was, fill in the blank, if it was in the 50s or the 60s and something like this hit, would the zeitgeist have actually, taken hold in that regard? So, according to you, I'm gathering the zeitgeist with Star Wars, maybe not, hard to say.
Completely. So let's get a little fussy, shall we?
Yeah.
That in talking about success, it's often tempting to say the reason something, let's call it Jane Austen or something else, let's call it Donald Trump or something else, let's call it Star Wars, did as well as they did is they fit especially well with the times. And those are extremely satisfying explanations. They're causal, but whether they're true has a lot of question marks associated with them. And the reason is history's only read once, only run once. It's read more than once, but it's run only once. And we don't have randomized controlled experiments, so we can't see how would Star Wars have done 10 years earlier, 10 years later, or 10 years later. It's tempting to think that the reason it did super well was it fit with the times. And that's not exactly false. It did do super well at the times. But the notion that those times were peculiarly receptive is, I think, in the end, unproved. I think it's fair to say that for Barack Obama to become president in 1932, good luck with that, with his name, and he's black, so in 1932 he wasn't going to win, so that's fair. But for Star Wars, unproven. And I think probably the deeper fact is that it got where it did, A, because it was fantastic, and B, because it had between 16 and 16,000 forms of luck. It got those things. And then early on, it hit hard in a good way and became culturally defining. A smaller example that is in my own field that I think is more intuitive is there was a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a runaway bestseller. It's done spectacularly well. It's terrific, but no one. It's kind of he's a little like Yoda, Denny. And he did spectacularly well with the book. But no one expected that book to do really well. Is it because it hit with the time? No. It's that it got a good notice in the New York Times. It got the benefit of a viral effect. People were listening to each other and they heard we should get this book. A lot of people got it, didn't read it, and it went whoosh. That's that going whoosh. Depends on things that aren't the zeitgeist, aren't even knowable in after the fact, but they happened.
Yeah, the zeitgeist is very much a thing you can almost take on faith, basically. It's the evidence of things not seen, where, you just can't grab onto it. Or maybe perhaps it's a 2020 hindsight situation, because I don't think George Lucas could have created Star Wars in 1967. I don't think his own life experience would not have allowed him to be able to ultimately create what he put on screen, to say nothing about the technology that he invented as part of the process of doing it, for that matter. You also already spoke to this a little bit, or at least opened the door, and so I'll ask you to walk a little further in some of the other effects that can help the fame equation to net out in terms of information cascades and network cascades. Could you speak a little bit more about that, please?
Okay, so let's talk about informational cascades. They're really fun. Suppose we have a small group, they're deciding what movie to go to, and the first person in our little group says, let's go see a French movie called Anatomy of a Fall. Fantastic movie, by the way. And the second person says, I don't know about that movie, but I guess if you say so, I'm for Anatomy of a Fall. And then the third person is kind of skeptical about movies with subtitles, but if the first two have said they want to go see Anatomy of a Fall, they say, yeah, I want to go see Anatomy of a Fall too. And then you have a cascade where people are influenced by informational signals that they're simultaneously amplifying. And if this sounds a little like a toy model, it is, but that's what happens with cultural runaway successes. It's what happened with the TV show Friends, where people said, do you want to see Friends? It's pretty good, and I like it. And then people started spreading it to each other. And it turns out that the volume of the informational signal can be really, really high, such that someone thinks, if I haven't seen, let's say, The Empire Strikes Back, I must be missing out because so many people say they should see that movie. And that's what happens with viral things. And this is based on humanity, not on new technology. It happened for Christianity. Christianity benefited from an informational cascade in the early days. It happened for the construction of the New Testament. It happened in a way that's very similar to that. This is not meant as a theological statement of any kind. It's just sociology of things.
Right.
It's informational cascade. There's also reputational cascade, where someone might say, okay, I'm going to see Anatomy of a Fall because they don't want that first person who spoke to think they're kind of interested only in bad movies, or they're scared of French movies. So the second person says, I want to say that, see that. Then the third person goes along, again, not because of the information, but because of the reputational signal. And not to like Taylor Swift. I say sincerely, I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan. Even if I weren't, I'd probably say something like that, because the number of people who think ill of you if you don't say that is not small. So people have reputational pressure to see at least Star Wars and to say they like it. Fortunately, it's good. So when they say they like it, they usually mean it. So there's informational cascades, there's reputational cascades, and there's also a phenomenon called group polarization, where people who like something or think something, if they talk with one another, they tend to intensify their own convictions. So we saw with Star Wars, people becoming more and more intensely devoted to it because they formed clubs of multiple kinds. Or they weren't clubs, really. They were just groups of friends in many cases. And they were fans, stands for fanatic. And that polarization phenomenon, which helped account for the rise of both President Obama and President Trump, they benefited from that, really helped. And the last one is network effects. So if you're not seeing Star Wars, you're out of a network, and that's not a lot of fun. Maybe all friends are in the network, and that can really help. The very idea of Swifties, that's a network. Swifties is a network.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And all right, we're going to pause the conversation right there, and we'll pick up with the rest of it tomorrow. And so that's going to do it for today's episode of the show. If you enjoy the show, please share it with other folks that you know. You can do that in person. You can do that online. You can do that with the algorithms by rating, reviewing, liking, subscribing, following, joining, all that fun stuff. And you can even help support the creation and production of this Daily Dose of Star Wars joy yourself. And you can find out more about that at patreon.com/SW7X7. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode as always. And may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyrighted by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.